a responsibility to, okay, that the son will not have to endure consequences of whether he does or doesn't. That's from the human realm. But but oftentimes what the Arminian doesn't understand is that there is a supernatural and a eternalistic understanding of these things, which the Bible completely speaks clearly on. Okay, that the human being, that if he does what he does, and especially with concern with salvation, that God takes not only the lead role, and not only is he the architect of what we will do, and what will happen, what will be according to his decrees, and how we can't tap into that eternal realm. And it's ironic because we serve an eternal God, right? That's created so the vastness of the universe, and he has to be bigger than the universe that he creates, right? No creation is ever bigger than the creator, generally speaking. So somehow the inability to see that God can be the first cause in all of our works and all of our, especially with regard to our salvation, is just it's just mind-boggling. And how I think that Flowers here is just on, if you look at his videos and his obsession with Calvinism, this is what a lot of people have this same bug. They don't get it, they don't see it, so they go on a campaign to try to refute it. But when they refute it, they're refuting the eternality of the sovereignty of God. And they're refuting extremely basic scriptures that demonstrate. The issue here is that while we have a human element that we can see, which is when God says, "Come, all that you would be saved," we see that's the human element. But then we also see just as clear that God draws those who are to come with regard to salvation. So that's the eternal element that we have to recognize, that we don't fully understand. But if we're honest with the text and Scripture, we will obey and listen and recognize what the text is telling you. And so it tells you why it is that you came, why it is that you even your son even cleaned the room. Why? Because God already knew that he would. It was already a done deal that these things would happen, that you would decide to go this way or that way. But somehow they just can't understand these things. Listen how simplistically Pastor Flowers verbalizes his problems with the inability within the Calvinist doctrine.
Gospel by either humbling themselves and accepting it as truth, or suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. Calvinism's doctrine of total inability teaches, however, that fallen sinners are born by God's decree, remember. They're born in such a condition that they cannot respond positively to God's own appeals to be reconciled from that fallen condition. Now let's just think about this. If I tell my child that he should clean his room, it does strongly imply that he could clean his room. That's basic common sense. I think that we'd all understand. But is that applicable to how God deals with all of humanity? Is the implication in Scripture of you should, does that always mean you could? Well, let me give an answer to that by way of analogy. Suppose you had a horrible gambling addiction, and as a result, you accrued a debt so large that it was literally impossible for you to repay within your lifetime. Would your inability to pay off this debt excuse you from paying it? Of course not. You should pay off your debt regardless of whether you could pay off this debt. This is an example, I think, of where inability does not necessarily remove responsibility, and should does not.
But are we using human experiences to try to override eternal sovereignty? That's the question that I'd like to know. Because you come up with a hypothetical or a scenario that would fit our human condition. It doesn't override what is already written, what's already decreed, what's already laid out in Scripture in black and white. It really doesn't. So his practical examples and hypotheticals really don't do anything other than to continue arguing for the practicality of what we see in our human nature. but it doesn't question, it doesn't bring to focus the eternality of what God has already laid out in that what will be. Okay, so he'll do this over and over and over ad nauseum, trying to get himself to understand and others to see the practicality of all of this, and the weight of what he will demonstrate will fall simply on the ears of those people who can't really, for some reason, fundamentally respect and be honest with the text in terms of what the text is saying. As it is, everyone can see the common human usage of the scriptures and how it pertains to our accountability. That's something we can experience. But what we need more respect and more honesty with the text is with those things that are laid out concerning the eternality of God, His sovereign decrees. That's what we need to obey more than, and just as much, but yet more than what is practically laid out in Scripture.
Not necessarily mean could. Likewise, the scriptures teach us that we should obey the law of God perfectly, Matthew 5:48, for example. But it also teaches us that no one could, from Romans 3 and Romans 8 and other places. Our moral inability to fulfill all the demands of the law does not remove our moral responsibility to that law. We have a sin debt that we cannot pay, yet Scripture seems to teach that we are held accountable for that debt nonetheless. In this instance, it certainly does seem that should does not imply could. But continuing with analogy above, suppose your wealthy and benevolent father offered to pay your gambling debt, if and only if you would confess your addiction and check into a rehab facility for gamblers. Clearly, this is something you should do. But here's the question. Could you do that? Well, of course you could. Your inability to pay off the debt in no way hinders you from accepting the benevolent offer, a well-meant offer of your father's provision. Likewise, with regard to the law, your benevolent and gracious father offers to pay your sin debt if you confess your sin addiction and you trust in him. Clearly, this is something you should do. But could you? I believe you could. Calvinist doctrine of total inability says you could not.
Another area that he's misunderstanding is the fact that he's saying that he's giving a real world human example, and he's framing it under could, should, and could, whereas the eternal decrees of God aren't open to us concerning who could do what. That's not our business. That's God's business. Could the child clean his room? That's God's business. The truck is in the way or something, or maybe he became I don't know. He became paralyzed at the time. I don't know. That's all. We don't know the ins and outs as to what his decree is and what anyone's individual condition is. All we know is that the decree, the call and the command is for us to obey. What a lot of Arminians do is argue for other people, other scenarios that are not practical, and they try to use a practical framework to try to convince themselves not to believe in God's sovereign decree. Whereas in this case, he's adding all of those human elements and putting them as stumbling blocks for other people to be able to, or rather, as he put it, could they do it? Absolutely. For those that God would call, we know that God doesn't call all of them. Many are called, few are chosen. We know that some will go and some will not. What do you know of their individual condition or their situation? Are you judging them like you judge the front of a book on every case? You don't know what people's cases are, but God internally knows the heart of all men. We don't, okay? We don't know, so we can't be the judge of all men. I think every Arminian would agree with that, but somehow Arminians want to say that, well, the sovereign of inability is just unfair. Well, who says? Who's it's unfair to who? God is the judge. He's the one that decides what is fair and what is not fair. Basically, what it is here is that you have to be honest with the text. You have to You have to bow down to the text. God is the Word. Christ is the Word in flesh. And so we have to obey what it says, and we have to get used to recognizing what it says, not what makes sense to us. And that's why I say that there are things in the Bible, like, for instance, the Trinity. We don't fully understand these things because this is eternality. These are eternal things that are in Scripture. If we decide we're going to follow the Bible based on every single detail of what makes sense to us, despite cultural context, despite language variations, despite history of the text, issues in history, and in this case, understanding the text, then we're absolutely going to run into stumbling blocks with regard to interpreting Scripture.